Today's church pulpits often feel more like corporate seminar stages than sacred spaces. Many focus on polish, production, and engaging speakers. We look for someone who can keep an audience's attention, share three relatable points, and of course, most importantly, finish on time. This focus has led to what could be called the preacher for hire industry. When a church loses its main teacher, it rarely looks within. Instead, they use search committees and post job ads and review resumes and preaching samples. And often they hire charismatic outsiders who stay for a while before leaving for better opportunities. When churches choose professional speakers instead of developing their own teachers, they break the important biblical link between teaching and local elder leadership. This shows a shift toward a more secular leadership style, moving away from the apostolic model. The main issue with professional preachers is their lack of a close connection with their congregations. A hired speaker may give a good sermon, but they don't know the people. They're out of touch with the congregation's real struggles and victories. Teaching without real relationships often becomes just sharing information. Real spiritual growth needs a teacher who knows the people well and works under the guidance of elders. Now, to be fair, a hired hand can sometimes connect with people over time, but typically, by the time that connection begins, the situation devolves into one of what I've seen at least three common scenarios. First, the connection becomes cliquey or cultish, a following of a particular personality that sows deep division and often pits the preacher's loyal fans against the local elders. Second, maybe the preacher maintains a shallowed, manufactured level of relationships in order to feign interest and keep their job security. Or third, just as relational roots begin to take hold, the preacher decides to move on to a better or bigger platform. Jesus issues a serious warning about spiritual leaders who treat the local church as nothing more than a job rather than a family. He said the hired worker who isn't a shepherd and doesn't own the sheep sees the wolf coming and abandons the sheep and runs away. He flees because he's a hired worker and doesn't care about the sheep. So when the pulpit is separate from the people, the church becomes more like a show for consumers. The congregation turns into a passive audience, judging each sermon by how entertaining it is. Instead of being a family cared for by local leaders who know them, people just rate the performance. To address this disconnect, I think we have to start by looking back at the apostolic deposit and testing ourselves against it. The New Testament model for church leadership is organic, localized, and relational. Leaders weren't recruited from external staffing agencies. They were identified, tested, and raised within the local community. The apostles laid out two distinct local roles. The elders serve as the actual shepherds who oversee the flock, and the deacons serve the congregation under the elders' oversight. Peter writes directly to a group of these local shepherds. He says, "Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, watching over them not under compulsion, but willingly according to God, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock." The apostles never taught that there should be a special office just for a preacher or a minister. Making the minister a separate leader is not part of the biblical framework for church structure. In the scriptures, those who preach and teach are deacons or lay people who serve under the elders. The key word being serve, not rule. So there's this glaring hypocrisy within traditions like the churches of Christ to which I belong. We take issue with the practice of elevating a pastor or a bishop to rule over a local congregation. We proudly proclaim that we have a plurality of elders. Yet, by importing a hired minister who serves as the primary spiritual authority, delivers all public teaching, and serves as the professional face of the church, well, we've functionally created the exact same unbiblical office. We just slapped a different title on the office door. How did we drift into this structure? Well, in the COC context, I believe it's a holdover from Reformation traditions that led into the Restorationist movement. The Reformation brought necessary reforms and had valid critiques against Rome, but in this area, it really just reinforced the institutionalization of the clergy. By making the sermon the central aspect of worship, reformers just replaced the Catholic priest with the Protestant academic. The pulpit became a lecture hall for professionals. The pastoral role became a corporate job. And so today's secular church leadership actually mirrors a Fortune 500 company, where the church is a franchise, people are consumers, and the preacher is the CEO or content creator. Now, every single time I have seen this critique raised, it has never failed that defenders of the modern minister system have inevitably pointed to biblical figures like Paul, Timothy, or Titus as examples of these sort of traveling preachers. But this is conflating two fundamentally different roles. These men did not sign a contract to be hired by a congregation and deliver weekly keynote addresses until they lose favor with the crowd and it becomes time to bring in a shiny new preacher. Biblically, evangelists and missionaries like Paul, Timothy, and Titus were commissioned by established elderships sent out to preach the gospel in unreached areas and plant new churches. Their ministry was outward facing and temporary in any single location, centered on founding communities of believers. In contrast, local teachers and elders were raised up from within those very communities, and they were tasked with ongoing teaching, spiritual care, and shepherding of the flock after the evangelist had moved on. This distinction is clear in passages like 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, where qualifications for elders and deacons are based on their local reputation and established relationships. So evangelists were foundation layers and planters, but they were not permanent resident teachers. Their presence was temporary and functional. They laid a foundation and they left. Paul explains to Titus, "For this reason I left you in Crete, so you might set right what remains unfinished and appoint elders in every city as I instructed." The apostolic missionary aimed to work themselves out of a job. Once a church matured enough to produce leaders, the missionary appointed elders and deacons and moved on. Congregations were entrusted to their own leaders, not a long-term pulpit minister. If we want strong churches, we need to stop depending on search committees to find the next leader. Church leaders should take charge of their own communities. Churches should focus on discipleship, finding time, and training faithful men from within to teach and to lead. Now, mentoring takes time, but raising leaders from inside the church creates a solid foundation that lasts. As a practical first step, leaders can identify members who demonstrate spiritual maturity and invite them to participate in leadership apprenticeships or small group teaching opportunities. Pairing less experienced members with seasoned elders or deacons for intentional mentorship will help develop their gifts. Regularly rotating teaching responsibilities in Bible studies or small gatherings will allow emerging leaders to grow in experience and confidence and connection with the congregation. Church leaders should also value character more than charisma. A local deacon may not have the smooth delivery or clever jokes of a professional speaker, but they care deeply for their church. They have shared in the same struggles and built trust and know how to speak to their community's needs. A healthy church doesn't need a flashy presentation. It needs faithful elders and humble deacons who teach and care for the people. We desperately need modern ministers to become scriptural deacons. Instead of occupying their own elevated office or acting as a higher class of Christian, they should adopt the biblical definition of a servant. They're meant to work under local elders to teach and serve the flock, not to be the star of the show. Let's abandon this secular corporate model of church staffing and return to the beautiful, sometimes messy, but deeply relational work of building up our own elders and deacons from within our own spiritual families.